All right, everyone. We are finally in the season finale of season one of Amazon's Rings of Power, the eighth and final episode. And we have come finally to a rather fitting finale to the series, and I think the best of the episodes thus far. It manages within the plot, and when I say within the plot, there are, I counted them, something in the order of 15 scenes, some of them very brief, but all of them working towards one unified end. And for all of the different figures that are brought into the action, there is a unity of purpose. And for that reason, it works. Even more than that, thematically, there's a great deal of um, power in the scenes because of the complexity of the ways in which the themes are handled. The episode is called Alloyed, and obviously one immediately thinks of the rings then, alloy being a reference often to metal. But to have something alloyed to something else is to have something in some sense debased, and yet also strengthened. So we will often, with gold rings, combine it with an alloy to give it a strengthening power. And that's going to be one of the themes of the episode, is the various ways in which we can play on the word alloy. So it's very cleverly done, I think, by the writers. I have been very critical of them for the often insipid dialogue and the very shallow characterization of many of Tolkien's beloved figures. But I think in this episode, they have exceeded their previous standards. And if they have in some ways shortchanged Tolkien's vision, and I'll say right away what I mean by that. But if they have shortchanged Tolkien there, they have nonetheless created a unity within their own world, and I think they deserve some credit for that. But in what way have they shortchanged Tolkien? Well, in the forging of the rings themselves, there's an account of Sauron in the guise of a benevolent entity by the name of Anatar, who convinces the elf smiths of Eregion to forge the rings of power. And there are 19 of them that they make. They make the 3 for the elves, 3 or 9 for the dwarves, and 7 for men. That is not what we're going to get here. We won't get any account of Anatar whatsoever. We will only get the 3 elven rings forged together, and done so in a rather clever way and a very symbolic way, and I think that works rather well. But the tale of Anatar and his teaching of the elfsmiths how to forge these rings of power has been set aside by the creators here in favor rather of concealing the identity of Sauron here. And they've done this throughout. There's been a great deal of mystery surrounding that. I suspect they were trying to create intrigue and suspense. Where is Sauron? Who is he? And there have been various guesses on the commentariat out there about who it might be. They have not really tipped their hand too much on that front. I know that some have guessed who it was. I myself did not guess. I did not think it was the stranger, and it is not the stranger. I did not, however, think that it was Halbrand either, because it seemed to me entirely implausible in terms of the way the story was being told. But here's the reveal. It is, in fact, Halbrand, who is Sauron. So I've spoiled it for you if you haven't seen it, but I'm assuming that you will have watched it before you've looked at this at any rate. Let me go through the scenes in chronological order. As I say, some of them are particularly well done. But all in all, they all work together towards a unity, and there's a sense of increased intrigue and suspense that gathers as the series draws to a conclusion, at least the first season. And that is also well done. It bodes well and encourages people to turn up for season 2. So very good conclusion, as I say. But we begin with the stranger. And the stranger is in Erin Gallen. Now, Erin Gallen is called the Greenwood, or rather Greenwood the Great, later known as Mirkwood. And of course, Mirkwood, as we read when in the Lord of the Rings, is where Sauron make an earlier appearance, and that's where he is here. And so we might think, for that reason, that the stranger is Sauron. And certainly the three deities, or the three mystics who come upon the stranger here, who have gone to the place where the comet is struck, believe that this is Sauron. And so they reverence him accordingly in this episode. And they're somewhat like the three wise men, I guess, coming to worship the infant Lord Jesus. They've come to and followed the star. The star has led them to this figure, and they believe him to be Sauron. Sauron, who has been confused because he has been confused by the Valar. So believe these three worshippers. And he is confused at this stage, that these three who are worshiping him are believing that he's Sauron. He doesn't know who he is. This is really a bit of an odd plot twist introduced at the beginning of the whole episode, and we're not sure who it is. I think in all likelihood it is Gandalf, because I cannot believe that a billion-dollar enterprise is going to want to cast aside Gandalf for what is the most plausible alternative, which is one of the Blue Wizards. The Blue Wizards would be in keeping with the chronology of Tolkien's Legendarium, but I don't think that the creators of this series really care about that too much, at least not at the expense of having Gandalf in the whole series. So I believe this to be Gandalf, and we'll have to wait till season 2 to find out who that is. But that's the first scene. The second scene, we have Galadriel and Halbrand together. Remember where we left off. Halbrand had been wounded very grievously in his side, and she and Galadriel had rode off from the Southlands on a 6-day journey somehow to Eregion, and they meet, and there they get elven healing to restore him to his state of health. And meanwhile, we find that Celebrimbor and Elrond are trying to solve the problem of how to use this small bit of mithril that they possess. Remember, the elves refused to give them the entirety of it, but how to use this small bit and make and amplify its power. And he says, Celebrimbor says, if only we could do more with less. And there's a reference to how the sun had once begun in a similarly small substance to this bit of mithril in his hands. It had once been the size of his hand as well, alluding back to the Legendarium of how the sun and the moon had come about from the two trees of the Valinor, one from the gold tree of Laurentius, and one from the silver tree of Telperion. The silver tree, its ancestor, or its offspring, is in present day Numenor, and we've already seen that tree. That tree is losing its blooms as we speak. So that reference, lots of good cross references there in that sense. And of course, from that small bit of things, there was great power unleashed. Can we do the same thing? This is the problem. And we get the re-encounter of two of the beloved figures here who work rather well together, it must be said, Elrond and Galadriel. And I have to say, Elrond is the great success of the entire series thus far. As an actor, he has great pathos in his face. He doesn't look as I imagined Elrond to look, but he acts well. His eyes are very expressive. He shows genuine warmth, and at the same time seems to show insight and wisdom in his words. And so he works rather well. Galadriel remains rather unsympathetic as a heroine, and again, very much unattractive as such. Whereas Celebrimbor is another success. I'd say he is the second great success in this series. And again, although he doesn't look the part, I think he's a very good actor and manages to show the pride of Celebrimbor and his zeal for artistry very well. But we get a re-encounter of Elrond and Galadriel, and we get Elrond apologizing to Galadriel for having not trusted her. And Galadriel explains her motivation for being there, which is not revenge as it appeared, but rather that she felt she was not worthy to pass into the Undying Lands, and she had not yet completed her task. It's a little bit better than the motivation of revenge that seemed to motivate her thus far. So at least they have done something here to redeem a character that seemed rather evil in her own motivations from top to bottom. But we cut over, and whether you want to see this as another scene or within the same scene, to Celebrimbor meeting and speaking with Halbrand, who has miraculously recovered and is now counseling Celebrimbor, and informs him that his former master had used to praise him for his terrific artistry, and Celebrimbor is suitably flattered. And he said that Celebrimbor was of all those smiths of old the greatest. Now, of course, what we know about Sauron was that he originally was the servant of the smith of the Valar himself, a figure by the name of Aule. So he has learned the craft of smithy from the best, but here he's probably referring to Morgoth in his reference, and he admires the three jewels he sees before him, says that he's never seen the like, which is, if it is Sauron speaking here, and we're quite certain later on that it is, he's most certainly lying. These are not the Silmarils that he sees. They are three jewels. But he makes the recommendation that they alloy the mithril with other metals, so that they might combine the strengths of those metals with the mithril's own qualities. And Celebrimbor is surprised at the suggestion somehow. And the tip here that it is Sauron is the phrase, call it a gift. Again, dramatic foreshadowing. We know that the rings of power were forged and given as gifts. Gifts having the sense here of being a poison as well as a boon. And we cut from that scene to Numenor itself. And a great scene of pathos as well. In fact, the entire, as I say, the entire 8th episode was a success to my mind, because we cut to King Tar Palantir dying in Numenor, Pharazôn bringing artists in to capture the king's visage, and granting him immortality in stone that he lacked or could not attain in life. And the reason that this is an apt phrase is it reveals something of Pharazôn's heart, namely his desire for immortality, very much in keeping with Tolkien's portrait of the sinful motivation of the men of this world. They want immortality, the one thing they lack, whereas the elves seek to persist and endure in this world, they being immortal from their conception. So there's a very human motivation, very much in keeping with Tolkien's view of this world, and I liked that touch. Now, Tar Palantir reveals that he has seen the future, and this is because he had regarded and looked upon the Palantir too long. So the Seeing Stone, he looked into this too long, and now cannot separate the past, the present, or the future, and has thus aged from it. This is very much like Denethor in The Lord of the Rings. He's gained great wisdom, but now he cannot separate what might be from what is. And it has aged him enormously. Remember, the rings lengthen a man's life, give him longevity. This is one of the effects of the rings of power. Whereas the Palanters seem to have the opposite effect. They confer a sort of wisdom, and yet they shorten a man's life. So you need the strength simply to look upon these. And even if you have that strength, it will wither you. And this is what has happened to Tar Palantir here. And he does counsel, however, that without a return to the old ways, Numenor is doomed. And we've already seen that his daughter, Miriel, has seen this herself, that like Atlantis, Numenor is going to be destroyed by water without a return to the alliance with the elves. And remember the difference between the king's men and the faithful. That's going to become key in this series. Well, we flip back to the elves now, however, in a different scene with Gil-galad, who proposes, when brought into conjunction with Celebrimbor and others, that they could, with the little bit of mithril that they have, form a crown, and thereby not lose the light of the mithril, and the circular form will give the light back to itself and will confer power. But, and this is one of the things that most endeared me to him, he does not want to wear this ring. He is reluctant and fearful of what power will do to him. Remember, this is the High King, but he does not want this mithril crown to be forged, and he says that the time has simply run out. The leaves of the tree have fallen, and they need to leave. And so he has now judged that they are to go into the Undying Lands and to leave Middle-earth at this point. Celebrimbor at this point introduces a thought that had not occurred to him previously, and is apparently shocking to Galadriel when she hears it, and that is that they could use the rings or the metal for a different purpose, and that is to forge a power not of the flesh, but over the flesh. And it is a power of the unseen world, he says. Now, for us, this is the moment when it's quite manifest that Halbrand is Sauron. And it's also manifest to Galadriel as well. She has a look of intense suspicion at this point, because Adar describes Sauron's work in the far north in the very same sorts of terms. Not a power not over the flesh, or not of the flesh rather, but over it. And it's a power of the unseen world. That was what he had been seeking in the north, and now he has proposed it once again in the very same terms to Celebrimbor, who is unwitting of that fact. So this is now becoming very intriguing, and Elrond reminds Gil-galad when the two of them are alone that when hope is there, it is never meager. So you have given up, O king, but there is still a faint hope here, and let us go forward. And for some reason, Gil-galad assents to this, and the forge is allowed to continue its process. And now we see Halbrand and Celebrimbor working at the forge, a work which we are told could take 3 centuries, and they have something like 3 weeks. And then we cut from those two working to the figures of Halbrand and Galadriel. Galadriel now having been set off on her suspicions are fully awakened that this is the man or the figure that she'd been seeking, namely Sauron. And there's a really strange dialogue scene in which he thanks her for pushing him to the heights no one else could have, and Halbrand says, "I will see to it that no one will ever forget it." A rather sinister and ominous phrase there. We cut away back to the stranger and the mystics. The mystics tell the stranger that he believes that he is Sauron, and they try to worship him as such, he stands up and the winds and the elements start whirling around and they knock him down. Very strange scene. And at this point, our friends, the Harfoots, come in and they try and interfere with things, and Sadok gets knifed. So I guess we're going to get rid of that figure. And the mystics and the stranger get into a fight, at which point they realize that this is not Sauron, and they say he is not Sauron. He is the Ishtar, or the wizard. Remember, both Sauron and Gandalf and others were members of the Istari, or the Order of the Wizards. And when he raises one of their staffs, they look like wraiths, like the ring wraiths in the unseen world. So these three female mystics are revealed as the Nazgals. There's my terrible joke here. Not the Nazgul, but the Nazgals. We got the three of them, and they look like this. And they disappear into moths, as does the staff. They just sort of disintegrate. It's a very strange scene. Anyway, we cut to Numenor, and a wonderful scene on the ship of Elendil and Miriel. Again, one of the great scenes of pathos here, when we have a blind queen regent, and we have a father bereft of a son. And they are both talking about the heavy price of faithfulness here. And Elendil says that there's little choice but to keep serving, and I, for one, will see to it that we make the end worth the price. So meditation here on suffering and faith and wisdom united with it. So again, great pathos in the scene, as I say, Muriel being blind, Elendil looking rather weak, you must say. I don't know what they've done in the scene, but they make him physically, he looks rather thin here. He's lost his wife. We learn he's lost his son, and now it appears that he has just lost the battle in the Southlands. Whereas we cue back to Pharazôn when they arrive in Numenor, clad in black, with tears in his eyes, looking upon the dead king, and we see the black banners betokening that the king is in fact dead. And the tension between the king's men, represented by Pharazôn, and the faithful, represented by Elendil and Miriel, coming back, is going to be one of the great scenes of intrigue in season 2. That's been set up very well here by this particular scene. Scene 7, we go back to Eregion. Halbrand makes the suggestion that rather than forcing the metals to join, they could be coaxed together. Now, I have no idea what this means. And actually, with respect to the smithing of various ores, I don't think it means a thing. However, it does mean something insofar as he is talking about the voluntary choice of uniting things by luring them through gifts. So this reference to alloying here, which was part of the title of the episode, comes to a pregnant fruition here in suggesting that the metals be, rather than forced, they be coaxed in the same way those that are going to be brought under his sway are going to be coaxed. And the means by which they are going to be coaxed is, of course, through their desire for power. And says that the problem thus far is that there is too much power for one object to hold. And he echoes Gil-galad in this, so it sounds wise. And again, he sounds very much like a figure of wisdom and counsel here. But we need to note that that Gil-galad's objection was a moral objection, whereas Halbrand is making a physical observation, that we need to weaken this for reasons of producing greater power. Whereas Gil-galad had been wanting to avoid power and the temptations of power, Halbrand wants to break it into two in order to gain power, but the power it will gain is power over those who wish to wield it. So very cleverly done here, I think. And finally, we get the scene in which Galadriel is going to confront Gil-galad, or Halbrand rather, because she has discovered by an emissary that the last king of the Southlands had died 1,000 years ago. The line had been broken. To which Halbrand responds, I told the truth when I said I found it on a dead man. Indeed he did, and no doubt he also killed that man. And that he reveals then that he has been awake since before the breaking of the first silence. And in that time I have had many names. And at this point she tries to stab him because he's just revealed who he is. And she fails. She falls to the ground. Rather pathetic attempt to kill him, actually. He fends off her, the thrust of her blade very simply. And we flash back to her in Valinor, clad in white raiment. And the figure to whom she then speaks is not Halbrand, but Finrod, her brother. And Finrod tells her that his mission was not to hunt Sauron, but to ensure that the path of peace that he also pursued came successful. Now, this is clearly Sauron presenting himself as Finrod here, and she's aware of it. And he counsels her to let the Rings of Power be forged as planned. Now, since she realizes that this is the case, you might have thought that she will then stop the Rings of Power from being forged when she emerges from this scene. She doesn't do that, but we're not quite there yet, because then they shift to a scene of Halbrand and she on the raft where we met them in the beginning. And he says that when Morgoth died, he was released and he felt the light of the One again, Eru Ilúvatar, and some sense thereby that he is, there is still goodness in him. But I think it's clear from this episode that this is not credible. He's simply trying to deceive her. And I don't think that she believes it for a second either. But we get the vision of the two of them in the water. This is, again, rather subtly done, in which we see Sauron with a crown on, Galadriel with something, probably queenly garments as well. And the two of them united in power. This is what he's offering to her. And he says to her, I alone can see your light. And her eyes sparkle in response. And if you think back to Cate Blanchett and when she's offered the Ring of Power by Frodo, and there's a sparkle of the Valar in her eyes, we think to some degree of the similar sorts of temptation here. So she sees a temptation, and remember, and he says to her at this point, I will make you not a tyrant, but a queen, stronger than the foundations of the earth. The exact same words that Galadriel spoke when in The Lord of the Rings, that temptation. And he says that she, what is the marriage here? Well, she will bind him to the light. He will bind her to power. And now we can see an allusion back to the myth of how the Silmaril had, the light of the Silmaril had been fused into this tree through the figures of good and evil, and created the mithril out of these this alliance of good and evil, or of light and power. And that's what he offers here. So although I objected to the understanding of good and evil in that mythology that was created of the mithril, nonetheless, I think that the directors have done very well here by connecting these two and what Sauron proposes to Galadriel with that myth of the tree. So again, let's give credit where credit is due, at least as far as I'm concerned. This was extremely well done. She, of course, refuses. Rightly so, of course, refuses there, and as we would expect. And he responds to her rebuke or her refusal with anger, turns on her and tries to press his advantage. He says, what will you do when I tell the elves that Sauron lives because of you? And she responds in anger. So the two of them are getting more and more angry. We get looks in their eyes. And Sauron's snake-like, the slit pupils appear to us for the first time as he looks at her. If there was any doubt about who he was before, which there really wasn't, there certainly is not now. We see the eye of Sauron looking at Galadriel. We cut away from that, and we see another figure in front of Galadriel, none other than Elrond. And she thinks this is just another form of deceit on Sauron's part, yells at Elrond that he is a deceiver, and demands that he prove himself, and then he does. So Sauron has left her at this point, and Galadriel is given the information that only the two of them can know, a rather Odysseus and Penelope-like scene from their early youth, where Galadriel had first found him. She is convinced that it is he, Elrond, and not Sauron. And Galadriel now rushes to Celebrimbor. And as I say, at this point, she could, having been persuaded by Sauron to forge the rings of power, stop that, knowing that it would stop Sauron's plans. But she doesn't do that. She proposes, and again, here departing from the account given in Tolkien, that rather than two rings being forged, that they forge three. And there's some ingenuity here in the scene, and there's also considerable wisdom in this, because the rationale that they produce three rings is based on this logic, that one ring would simply corrupt. And this is what Gil-galad has already revealed. One ring is going to corrupt just like one crown would. Too much for one head to bear. Two would simply divide, would set them at odds against each other, and thereby serve the purposes of the enemy. Whereas three would have balance, she says. And so she says that rather than produce the two rings, they should produce three, and the three would be forged by the elves alone, untouched by other hands, including Sauron's. And this is the thing that, of course, lends them an ability to resist his power later on. Yes, there were three elven rings that he gave to them, but he did not touch them. And so they have a resistance to his power that will not go as long as Middle-earth remains. And what we find, though, is that Celebrimbor says that they have not sufficient alloy to forge three rings, and he needs better materials then. He needs gold and silver from Valinor, and of course, there is no such gold or silver except in the form of the dagger. And the line that true creation involves sacrifice comes to the fore again, echoing the words of the faithful earlier on. Now we have Galadriel sacrificing the memory of her brother and the memory of course, Valinor itself. It's now going to have to be cause her great pain and great sacrifice so that this might be achieved. And so again, rather well done, one must say. However, it departs from Tolkien's legendarium. It works as theater on its own merits. We return back to Nori and the stranger, who at this point is now speaking finally comprehensible diction, seems to have a sense of himself, having confronted the evil characters, the Nazgals, as I call them. He has a sense of himself, and he says that he needs to go to Rune, however, to find himself still. He doesn't know entirely who he is, but he's going to have to go to Rune. And he says that he wants a companion for that, because journeys are lonely, but adventures, he says, must be shared. Sounds rather Gandalf-like. And as I said, I cannot believe that they're going to, with $1 billion enterprise, they're going to dispense with such a beloved character as Gandalf for a blue wizard simply because it fits in with Tolkien's legendarium. I just don't think that is possible for that reason only. We cut back to Eregion, to the elven smiths. We see the forging scene. Happens rather quickly, rather beautifully. The melting down of Galadriel's dagger in the forge. For a brief second, when the mithril is thrown into the middle of it, we get something looking like the eye of Sauron, the vertical slit. And the outcome of this molten concoction is the rings of Nenya, Narya, and Vilya. And at this point, we get the undertones of darkness in the music, which is rather beautifully done. I think the music works rather well throughout the episodes here. And but what we don't get is anything of the creation of the other rings of power. No mention of it. No sense that they were being created, that they would be created, or that it was of any consequence, that it wasn't only the elves that were being given rings, but the men and the dwarves. Remember that there were 20 rings in total. There was the 3 for the elves, the 7 for the men, the 9 for the dwarves, and then, of course, the one master ring, the ring of power that Sauron himself would forge to bring them all in the darkness, bind them. But we get this shift from in the elven faces. So now they've created these 3 rings of power. The 3 faces of the 3 wielders of the rings are looked upon. Who are these 3? Elrond, Galadriel, Celebrimbor. We look at these 3. Elrond sees the scroll revealing that Halbrand is not who he says he was. So we see shock and horror in his face, rather dismay, perhaps. We shift to Galadriel, who looks upon Elrond's disappointment, perhaps. It's unclear that she's looking at his face. We just go from one face to the next. And finally, Celebrimbor, who looks very proud at the creation of these 3 rings. And then we go from their faces and their eyes to the eye of Sauron, who in his pupil is looking upon the 3 rings, but also in the background at Mount Doom, and they're captured in this wonderful image in his eye. The light of his eye is lighting upon Mount Doom, but also the 3 rings of power that are going to unite them to that place. And he strides purposefully towards that, clothed in black, now with a cape, looking rather Darth Vader-like. And the end credits of the entire episode, we hear a song for the first time. Rather disappointing to my mind. Not that it wasn't beautiful, but melancholic in tone rather than menacing. 3 rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. And then 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. That is sung for a few minutes at the end of the story, presumably skirting over the fact that we've not seen any discussion of the creation of these other rings, but that it presumably has already transpired. I don't know. All in all, this was by far the most successful episode, and it lends sufficient intrigue to make us want to return to the next season. I will return to my thoughts on that, hopefully with a bit of better technical expertise next time. I'll put some stills in the background, maybe some footage so I can comment on it. But for now, thanks for sticking with me. I'm Dr. Scott Masson. Please like and share this video if you found it helpful. Till next time.